The dust swirled in angry clouds down Main Street as Isabella Martinez stumbled forward, her torn white dress dragging through the dirt like a flag of surrender. Blood trickled from a cut above her left eye, and purple bruises bloomed across her arms like twisted flowers. Behind her, the jeers and catcalls of Millbrook's finest citizens followed like a pack of hungry wolves. "There goes the Martinez whore," someone shouted from the safety of the boardwalk. "Thought she could parade around town like a decent woman." Isabella's bare feet found purchase on the rough wooden planks as she climbed onto the sidewalk. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the judgment that had branded her soul as surely as a hot iron brands cattle. 3 weeks ago, she'd been Isabella Martinez, seamstress and daughter of the town's most respected blacksmith. Today, she was nothing more than Millbrook's latest scandal, a cautionary tale whispered behind lace curtains and over Sunday dinner. The crowd pressed closer, emboldened by her silence and obvious distress. Mrs. Henley, the banker's wife, stepped forward with the righteous fury of a woman who'd never known real hardship. "You've got some nerve showing your face in broad daylight," the older woman hissed, her gloved finger pointed like a weapon. "After what you did, after the shame you've brought on this town, decent folks shouldn't have to look at the likes of you." Isabella raised her chin despite the pain, despite the shame that threatened to crush her beneath its weight. "I haven't done anything wrong," she whispered, but her voice cracked like dry timber. The crowd erupted in harsh laughter. "Nothing wrong?" Dr. Whitmore pushed through the gathering, his face red with indignation. "Nothing wrong about carrying on with a married man? Nothing wrong about destroying the Reverend's family?" Isabella's knees nearly buckled at the accusation, the lie that had destroyed her life, the twisted truth that had turned neighbor against neighbor and friend against friend. She opened her mouth to defend herself once more, to proclaim her innocence to people who'd already decided her guilt. But the words died in her throat. What was the point? They'd made up their minds based on gossip and speculation, choosing to believe the worst rather than seek the truth. The real story of Reverend Morrison's unwanted advances, his threats when she'd refused him, his wife's jealous rage when she discovered his obsession, would never be heard above the roar of public condemnation. "Please," Isabella managed, her voice barely audible above the crowd's growing hostility. "I just need to get my things. I'll leave town, I promise. You'll never have to see me again." "Too late for promises now, girl," growled Sheriff Benedict, a man who'd once tipped his hat respectfully to her father. "You should have thought about consequences before you spread your legs for a man of God." The crude words hit Isabella like physical blows, and she staggered backward into the dusty street. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to shed in front of these people, these former friends and neighbors who'd turned against her with such vicious speed. That's when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the edge of town. Through her haze of pain and humiliation, Isabella saw a lone rider on a bay gelding, his weathered face set in lines of controlled fury as he took in the scene before him. Thomas Harrison had the kind of presence that made crowds part without him saying a word, the quiet authority of a man who'd earned respect through actions rather than birthright. The mob fell silent as Tom dismounted, his spurs ringing against the wooden planks as he stepped onto the boardwalk. His gray eyes swept over the gathered townspeople with undisguised contempt before settling on Isabella's battered form. "Well," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment, "looks like I rode into town just in time to see what passes for Christian charity in Millbrook these days." Isabella looked up at this unexpected defender, this man she knew only by reputation as the successful rancher who kept to himself and minded his own business. Why would he involve himself in her disgrace? What could he possibly gain by standing against the entire town? But as their eyes met across the dusty street, Isabella saw something she hadn't seen in weeks. Not pity, not disgust, not cruel amusement. In Thomas Harrison's steady gaze, she saw recognition, not of her shame, but of her worth. And for the first time since her world had collapsed, Isabella Martinez dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The silence that followed Tom Harrison's words stretched taut as a wire fence in winter. The crowd of Millbrook's finest citizens found themselves facing a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his complete intolerance for bullies. Tom's weathered hands hung loose at his sides, but everyone present understood the quiet menace in his stance. Sheriff Benedict was the first to find his voice, though it carried less authority than usual. Now, Tom, this ain't your concern. We're just dealing with a situation that's gotten out of hand. Tom's gray eyes never left the sheriff's face as he replied, Situation? That what you call beating up a woman in broad daylight on Main Street? His gaze swept over the crowd, taking in their guilty expressions and suddenly averted eyes. Because where I come from, we call that cowardice. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, his chest puffed with indignation. You don't understand, Harrison. This woman has brought scandal and sin into our community. She's been carrying on with Reverend Morrison, breaking up his marriage, corrupting. Has she now? Tom interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded violence. And I suppose you witnessed this alleged carrying on personally, did you, Doc? The doctor's face reddened. Well, no, but everyone knows. Everyone knows what they've been told to know. Tom cut him off again. Question is, who's doing the telling and what they're getting out of it? Isabella watched this exchange from her position in the dirt, hardly daring to believe that someone was actually defending her. For 3 weeks, she'd endured whispered accusations, turned backs, and outright hostility from people who'd known her since childhood. No one had asked for her side of the story. No one had questioned the convenient narrative that painted her as the temptress and Reverend Morrison as the helpless victim of feminine wiles. Tom Harrison dismounted and walked toward her, ignoring the crowd's murmurs of disapproval. When he reached Isabella, he knelt down in the dust without regard for his clean clothes, bringing himself to her eye level. Miss Martinez, he said quietly, his voice gentle in a way that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Can you stand? Isabella nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain it was true. Tom offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, warm and steady as he helped her to her feet. The simple human contact after weeks of isolation nearly undid her completely. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom's eyes searched her face, taking in the fresh bruises, the split lip, the hollow look of someone who'd been pushed beyond endurance. Who did this to you? He asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Isabella glanced nervously at the crowd, then back at Tom. It doesn't matter. They're right about one thing. I should leave town. There's nothing left for me here. That's not what I asked, Tom said firmly. I asked who put their hands on you. Mrs. Henley pushed forward, her face twisted with righteous fury. She brought this on herself, flaunting herself around town like some kind of harlot, tempting good Christian men. Tom's attention snapped to the older woman with laser intensity. Mrs. Henley, I'm going to stop you right there before you say something that makes me forget I was raised to be respectful to ladies. The banker's wife recoiled as if she'd been slapped. How dare you take her side? You don't know what she's done. Then enlighten me, Tom said, his voice deceptively calm. Tell me exactly what Miss Martinez has done that deserves a beating in the street. The crowd exchanged uncertain glances. When pressed for specifics, their accusations suddenly seemed less solid than they'd appeared moments before. Dr. Whitmore cleared his throat importantly. She's been seen entering and leaving the church at odd hours. Mrs. Morrison found them together in the Reverend's office after dark. Found them doing what exactly? Tom pressed. Well, talking, the doctor admitted reluctantly, but it was inappropriate. A young, unmarried woman has no business meeting privately with a married minister. Tom's expression grew increasingly skeptical. So the crime here is talking? In a church? With the door open? Sheriff Benedict stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. Tom, you're new to the details of this situation. There's been evidence of improper correspondence. Gifts exchanged. What kind of gifts? Tom interrupted. The sheriff faltered. Well, books, religious texts, but the implications, Tom said slowly, seem to be coming from the minds of people determined to see scandal where none exists. Isabella looked up at her unlikely defender with growing amazement. In 5 minutes, Tom Harrison had done what she'd been unable to accomplish in 3 weeks. He'd forced the town to examine the actual evidence behind their accusations. Mrs. Morrison pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears and makeup. The Reverend's wife was a thin, nervous woman who'd always seemed intimidated by her husband's commanding presence. "She's trying to steal my husband," she wailed. "I've seen the way she looks at him during services." Tom studied the distraught woman with compassionate eyes. "Mrs. Morrison, has your husband given you reason to believe he's been unfaithful?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. Well, he's been distant lately, distracted, and he speaks about her spiritual development." "About her spiritual development," Tom repeated carefully. "Which would be his job as minister, wouldn't it?" Isabella found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mrs. Morrison, I would never try to take your husband. I went to the church seeking guidance after my father died. Reverend Morrison offered to help me through my grief, and I was grateful for his counsel. That's all." The Reverend's wife stared at Isabella with confusion and growing uncertainty. But he said you were pursuing him, that you were making advances." A cold silence fell over the crowd as the implications of her words sank in. Tom's voice when he spoke carried the weight of absolute authority. "Where is Reverend Morrison right now, Mrs. Morrison?" The woman's face crumpled. He left town yesterday, said he needed time to pray and seek guidance. He didn't say when he'd be back." Tom nodded grimly. "Convenient timing. Miss Martinez gets beaten in the street, and the good Reverend suddenly needs to commune with the Almighty somewhere, far from the consequences of his lies." Sheriff Benedict's face had gone pale as he began to understand the true scope of what had happened. "Now hold on, Tom. You're suggesting that Reverend Morrison—" "I'm suggesting that a man who runs away when the truth starts coming to light probably had good reason to run," Tom replied coldly. "And I'm stating flat out that this town owes Miss Martinez an apology for believing the worst about her, without bothering to ask for her side of the story." Isabella felt tears stinging her eyes. Not tears of shame this time, but of relief so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. Someone believed her. After weeks of isolation and condemnation, someone had looked at the evidence and found it wanting. Tom turned back to Isabella, his expression gentling. "Miss Martinez, do you have somewhere safe to stay?" Isabella shook her head. "Mrs. Patterson turned me out of my boarding room 3 days ago. She said my presence was corrupting the other tenants." Tom's jaw tightened with controlled anger. "Well, that's going to change right now." He turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Miss Martinez is coming with me to my ranch until this mess gets sorted out properly. And if anyone in this town has a problem with that decision, they can take it up with me personally." Dr. Whitmore sputtered in outrage. "You can't just take her away?" "She needs to answer for what?" Tom's voice cut through the doctor's protests like a blade. "For being the victim of a married man's lies? For having her reputation destroyed by gossip and speculation? For being beaten by a mob too eager for scandal to bother with facts?" The crowd began to disperse, their earlier righteous fury replaced by uncomfortable shame. As the truth of the situation became clearer, many of Millbrook's citizens found themselves remembering Isabella's kindness, her quiet dignity, her devotion to her late father. The narrative they'd so eagerly embraced suddenly seemed not just wrong, but cruel. Tom helped Isabella toward his horse, noting how she favored her left leg and moved with the careful precision of someone trying to hide pain. "Can you ride?" he asked quietly. "I think so," Isabella replied, though her voice carried uncertainty. Tom mounted first, then reached down to help Isabella up behind him. As she settled against his back, her arms circling his waist for balance, Isabella felt safer than she had in weeks. "Why?" she whispered as they rode away from the crowd. "Why did you help me when everyone else turned away?" Tom was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stand by and let lies destroy innocent lives. And because sometimes the most important thing a man can do is the right thing, even when it's not the easy thing." As they rode toward the Harrison Ranch, Isabella pressed her face against Tom's strong back, and allowed herself to believe, for the first time in weeks, that maybe her story wasn't over after all. Maybe there was still hope for redemption, for healing, for a future beyond the shame and condemnation that had nearly destroyed her. Behind them, Millbrook continued its daily business, but the seed of doubt Tom had planted would grow. Questions would be asked, stories would be re-examined, and eventually the truth would emerge completely. But for now, Isabella Martinez was safe, protected by a man who valued justice over popular opinion and saw worth where others saw only scandal. The road to the Harrison Ranch stretched ahead of them, dusty and long, but for the first time in weeks, Isabella wasn't walking it alone. The Harrison Ranch stretched across a valley between rolling hills dotted with cattle. The main house sitting solid and welcoming beneath a grove of mature oak trees. As Tom helped Isabella down from his horse, she winced at the pain shooting through her injured leg but tried to hide it behind a mask of stoic determination. Tom noticed anyway. He had the observant eye of a man who'd spent years caring for injured animals and reading the subtle signs of pain and distress. "Easy," he said gently, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow. "No need to pretend you're not hurting. Pride's a luxury you can't afford right now." Isabella looked up at him with surprise. Most men of her acquaintance would have either ignored her discomfort entirely or made a show of excessive concern that somehow managed to make her feel weaker rather than supported. Tom's matter-of-fact acknowledgement of her pain, followed by practical assistance, was something entirely different. The front door opened before they reached the porch, revealing a middle-aged Mexican woman with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of honest work. She took one look at Isabella's battered condition and immediately switched into a rapid stream of Spanish that Tom seemed to understand perfectly. "Isabella, this is Maria Santos," Tom said by way of introduction. "She keeps this ranch running and everyone on it properly fed and doctored. Maria, this is Miss Isabella Martinez. She's going to be staying with us for a while." Maria's expression softened with understanding and sympathy as she approached Isabella. "Mija," she said gently, using the Spanish endearment that meant "my daughter." "What have they done to you?" The kindness in the older woman's voice nearly undid Isabella completely. After weeks of harsh judgment and cruel words, Maria's maternal concern felt like cool water on sun-parched earth. "I'm all right," Isabella managed to say, though her voice betrayed the lie. Maria made a dismissive sound that clearly indicated what she thought of that particular falsehood. "Come inside, child. We get you cleaned up, get some food in you. Then we worry about being all right." The interior of the Harrison Ranch house was comfortable without being pretentious. Well-built furniture that showed the wear of daily use, books scattered on tables, windows that let in plenty of light. It felt like a home rather than just a house, lived in and welcoming in ways that spoke of genuine contentment rather than mere prosperity. Tom gestured toward a comfortable chair near the fireplace. "Sit down before you fall down," he said with gentle authority. "Maria, could you take a look at her injuries? I'm better with horses than people when it comes to medical matters." As Maria bustled away to gather medical supplies, Tom settled into the chair across from Isabella, his gray eyes studying her with the same careful attention he might give a skittish horse he was trying to gentle. "Feel like telling me what really happened?" he asked quietly. "Not the version the town's been spreading around, but the truth?" Isabella's hands trembled as she smoothed her torn dress over her knees. Where to begin? How to explain the series of small misunderstandings and deliberate manipulations that had transformed her from respected seamstress to town pariah? "My father died 4 months ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Heart gave out while he was working at the forge. I was lost. We'd been so close, and suddenly I was completely alone." Tom nodded encouragingly, but didn't interrupt. "Reverend Morrison approached me after the funeral, said he could see I was struggling with grief, offered to provide spiritual guidance. I was grateful. Papa had always been my anchor, and without him, I felt like I was drowning." Isabella paused, remembering those early conversations with the Reverend, how his concern had seemed so genuine, so pastoral. "At first, our meetings were perfectly proper. He'd recommend scriptures for comfort, talk about God's plan for those who suffered loss. I thought, I thought he was genuinely trying to help me find my way through grief. But it changed, Tom said, and it wasn't really a question. Isabella nodded miserably. Gradually, he started asking about my personal life, my hopes for the future, suggested that God might have plans for me that involved helping him in his ministry. He said his wife didn't understand the burdens of spiritual leadership, that he needed someone with a more receptive heart to truly support his calling. Maria returned with a basin of warm water and clean cloths, settling herself beside Isabella's chair with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to tending injuries. As she began gently cleaning the cuts and bruises, Isabella continued her story. I was naive enough to think he meant helping with church activities, organizing social events, visiting the sick, that sort of thing. But then he started requesting private meetings, saying he needed to discuss confidential parish matters, and the books he lent me. Isabella's cheeks flushed with remembered embarrassment. They weren't religious texts at all. They were romantic poetry, love letters written by famous men to their mistresses. Tom's expression darkened, but his voice remained carefully controlled. Did he put his hands on you? Isabella shook her head quickly. No, nothing like that, but he made his intentions clear enough. Talked about how lonely he was, how his marriage had become a burden rather than a blessing. Suggested that perhaps God had brought us together for a purpose beyond mere spiritual guidance. And when you refused his advances, Tom prompted, he became different, cold, said I was being foolish, that I was throwing away a chance for security and position that might never come again. When I told him I had no interest in being anyone's mistress, especially not a married minister's, he grew angry, said I was ungrateful, that he'd wasted his time trying to elevate someone too ignorant to recognize an opportunity. Maria muttered something under her breath in Spanish that sounded distinctly unflattering to Reverend Morrison's character as she applied salve to a particularly nasty bruise on Isabella's arm. That's when Mrs. Morrison found us, Isabella continued, not in some compromising position, as the gossips would have it, but with me trying to return his books and him blocking the church door, trying to convince me to reconsider his proposal. She walked in just as he was trying to touch my face, telling me I was too beautiful to waste my life on solitude and poverty. Tom's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained gentle. What did you do? I pushed past him and ran, but Mrs. Morrison had seen enough to misunderstand everything. She saw her husband's hands on me, saw the romantic books, heard him talking about my beauty. She jumped to the conclusion that I was the seductress, that I'd been pursuing him. And Morrison let her believe it, Tom said grimly. Isabella nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Worse than that, he confirmed her suspicions, told her I'd been making advances, that he'd been trying to counsel me away from sinful thoughts, said I was obsessed with him, that he was concerned for my spiritual welfare. Maria finished bandaging Isabella's wounds and sat back on her heels, her dark eyes blazing with indignation. That man is no minister of God, she declared flatly. He is a coward who would destroy an innocent girl to protect his own reputation. Tom stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back again. So Morrison gets to disappear until the scandal dies down, leaving you to face the consequences of his lies. Convenient for him. The whole town believed him, Isabella said brokenly. Why wouldn't they? He's their spiritual leader, a pillar of the community. I'm just the blacksmith's daughter with no family left to defend her reputation. You're a woman who deserves better than what you've been given, Tom said firmly, and you're not facing this alone anymore. Isabella looked up at him through her tears. Why are you doing this? You barely know me. Helping me will only hurt your standing in the community. Tom returned to his chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Isabella, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. A person's worth isn't determined by their reputation or social standing. It's determined by their character, their actions, their willingness to do what's right even when it's difficult. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I've watched you in town over the years. You were devoted to your father, kind to everyone you met, never spoke ill of others, even when they deserved it. That doesn't just disappear because some manipulative bastard decided to use you as a scapegoat for his own weakness. Maria nodded approvingly. Senor Tom speaks truth. Good people recognize goodness in others. Bad people see only what serves their purposes. Isabella felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of shame and self-doubt that had been choking her for weeks. I keep thinking I should have handled it differently. Maybe if I'd been more careful, more aware of how my meetings with him might be perceived. Stop right there, Tom interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. What happened to you wasn't your fault. Morrison is a grown man in a position of authority who chose to abuse that position. You were grieving, vulnerable, seeking spiritual comfort in the place where you had every right to expect to find it. You did nothing wrong. The simple declaration hit Isabella like a physical blow. For weeks, she'd been tormented by questions about her own culpability, wondering if she'd somehow invited Morrison's advances through naivety or carelessness. To hear someone state unequivocally that the fault lay entirely with her accuser was almost too much to process. I don't know how to move forward from this, she admitted. Even if people eventually learn the truth, the scandal will always be part of my story. No decent man will want to marry a woman who's been at the center of such talk. Tom's expression grew thoughtful. Isabella, what if I told you that the opinions of people who would judge you for being the victim of another man's lies aren't worth having? What if the right man, the man worthy of you, would see your strength in surviving this ordeal rather than weakness in having endured it? Isabella stared at him, seeing something in his gray eyes that made her heart skip unexpectedly. Was he speaking hypothetically, or was there a more personal meaning behind his words? Before she could analyze it further, Maria stood up with a satisfied nod at her handiwork. Enough serious talk for now. This girl needs food and rest before anything else. Time heals many wounds, but it works better when the body's strong. Tom smiled at his housekeeper's practical wisdom. Maria's right. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. For tonight, you're safe, you're welcome, and you're among people who see you for who you really are. As Maria led Isabella to a comfortable guest room and Tom returned to his evening chores, Isabella felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone drowning, but the quiet, steady hope of someone who'd found solid ground after weeks of shifting sand. For the first time since her father's death, Isabella Martinez dared to believe that her future might hold something more than mere survival. The town Disgrace might, with time and the support of good people, become something else entirely. A woman who'd faced the worst and emerged stronger for it. Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Inside the Harrison Ranch house, three people who'd found each other across the divide of circumstances and suspicion settled into an evening of quiet contentment, building the foundation for something that might, eventually, be called family. 2 weeks had passed since Tom brought Isabella to the ranch, and the transformation was remarkable. The hollow look of desperation had faded from her eyes, replaced by something that might eventually become peace. Her physical injuries had healed under Maria's careful attention, but more importantly, the deeper wounds to her spirit were beginning to close as well. Isabella had thrown herself into ranch life with the determination of someone who needed purpose to heal. She'd taken over much of the bookkeeping, bringing the same meticulous attention to Tom's accounts that she'd once applied to her sewing. The ledgers, which had been a chaotic mess of scribbled notes and forgotten entries, now showed neat columns and careful calculations that revealed the ranch's true financial position. You've been undercharging for your beef, Isabella observed over breakfast, looking up from the account book she'd spread across the kitchen table. The Morrison Ranch gets the same price you do, but their cattle aren't nearly as well bred or well fed. Tom paused in his coffee drinking, surprised by her business acumen. How do you know about Morrison's cattle? I used to do mending for Mrs. Morrison before. Isabella's voice caught slightly at the memory, but she pushed through it. She complained constantly about how thin their stock was, how they had to supplement their feed because their pastures weren't producing enough grass. Maria nodded approvingly from where she stood at the stove. La Niña has good head for numbers. You listen to her, Senor Tom. Tom found himself studying Isabella's face as she bent over the ledger. noting the way morning light caught the gold highlights in her dark hair, the determined set of her jaw as she worked through complex calculations. She was beautiful, but it was more than physical beauty. There was an intelligence and strength about her that had only become more apparent as she recovered from her ordeal. "I'll consider raising prices," Tom said, though his attention was more on the woman making the suggestions than on the financial implications. "What else have you discovered in those books?" Isabella's cheeks flushed with pleasure at being taken seriously. "You could expand your breeding program. Your bulls are producing exceptional calves, but you're not charging stud fees to other ranchers. And your hay crop is so good you could sell the surplus instead of just storing it." Tom leaned back in his chair, impressed despite himself. "You've learned a lot about ranching for someone who's been here 2 weeks." "I've been listening when you and the hands talk," Isabella replied, "and asking Maria questions when you're out working. I want to understand this life, this place that's given me sanctuary." Before Tom could respond, the sound of approaching riders interrupted the domestic tranquility. Through the window, they could see 3 men on horseback heading toward the house. Sheriff Benedict, Dr. Whitmore, and Judge Harrison, Tom's older brother who served as the territorial magistrate. Isabella's face went pale, her hands gripping the ledger with white knuckles. "They've come for me," she whispered. "Someone in town must have convinced them to press charges, or maybe Reverend Morrison has returned." Tom stood up, his expression grim. "Nobody's taking you anywhere, Isabella. You're under my protection, and that means something in this territory." Maria moved protectively closer to Isabella's chair. "You want me to take La Niña to the back bedroom while you talk to them?" "No," Isabella said, surprising them both with the steel in her voice. "I'm done hiding. If they have something to say about me, they can say it to my face." Tom felt a surge of admiration for her courage. The frightened, broken woman he'd rescued from the street had transformed into someone willing to face her accusers, head-on. The 3 men dismounted and approached the house with the careful formality of an official delegation. Tom stepped onto the porch to meet them, Isabella close behind him, despite his gesture for her to stay inside. "Tom," Judge Harrison nodded to his younger brother. "Miss Martinez, I hope you're both well." "Well enough, considering," Tom replied carefully. "What brings you out here, James?" Judge Harrison, a man who'd inherited their father's diplomatic nature along with his judicial temperament, chose his words carefully. "We've come to discuss some developments in town, things that affect Miss Martinez's situation." Isabella stepped forward, her chin raised despite the tremor in her voice. "Has Reverend Morrison returned? Is he pressing charges against me for something?" Sheriff Benedict shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Not exactly, miss." "See, that's part of what we need to discuss." Dr. Whitmore, looking distinctly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should speak privately, Tom. This is delicate matter." "Anything you have to say about Miss Martinez can be said in her presence," Tom replied firmly. "She's not a child to be spoken around." Judge Harrison dismounted, his expression grave. "Very well. Miss Martinez, we owe you an apology, a formal official apology on behalf of the town of Millbrook." Isabella stared at him in shock. "I don't understand." "Mrs. Morrison came to see me yesterday," the judge continued. "She'd been doing some investigating of her own after your encounter in town. Found some disturbing evidence in her husband's personal effects." Sheriff Benedict took up the explanation, his voice heavy with regret. "Seems the Reverend kept a collection of letters from young women in various towns where he'd served, all following the same pattern: spiritual guidance that turned into inappropriate advances, followed by accusations against the women when they refused his proposals." Isabella's knees nearly buckled with relief and vindication. "He did this to others?" "At least 5 that we've identified, Doctor," Whitmore said quietly. "All young, all recently bereaved or otherwise vulnerable. Mrs. Morrison found detailed accounts in his private journal describing his techniques for identifying and pursuing such women." Tom's face darkened with fury. "And where is Morrison now?" Judge Harrison's expression was grim. "Gone." Mrs. Morrison confronted him when he returned to collect his belongings. He admitted to everything, claimed it was a sickness he couldn't control, and disappeared again. She's filed for divorce, and is seeking an annulment of their marriage on grounds of fraud. Isabella swayed slightly, overwhelmed by the enormity of her vindication. Tom's arm immediately went around her waist, steadying her against his strong frame. "So the town knows the truth now?" Isabella asked weakly. Sheriff Benedict nodded shamefully. "Word's spreading fast. Folks are, well, they're horrified by how they treated you, especially after Mrs. Patterson found one of Morrison's letters hidden in her daughter's room. Seems he'd been working on that girl too, before you became his focus. Mrs. Patterson's daughter is 16 years old, Doctor," Whitmore added, his voice tight with disgust. "When she realized what could have happened, what might have happened if Morrison hadn't become fixated on you instead." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling sick at the thought of that young girl suffering what she'd endured. "Is she all right? Sarah Patterson, I mean?" "She's shaken but unharmed," the sheriff assured her. "Her mother's beside herself with guilt about how she treated you, knowing you might have inadvertently protected her own daughter." Judge Harrison stepped closer, his official bearing softening into something more personal. "Miss Martinez, the town council has asked me to extend their formal apologies and to make it clear that you're welcome to return to Millbrook anytime you choose. Your reputation has been completely restored." Isabella looked up at Tom, seeing pride and something deeper in his gray eyes. "Thank you for telling me," she said to the delegation, "but I'm not ready to return to town just yet." "Understandable," the judge replied. "You've been through a terrible ordeal. Take all the time you need." After the men left, Isabella sat heavily in her chair, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her fortunes. Tom knelt beside her, taking her hands in his work-roughened palms. "How do you feel?" he asked gently. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, sorting through the complex emotions warring in her chest. "Vindicated," she said finally. "Relieved. Angry that it took this long for the truth to come out. Sad for Mrs. Morrison and that poor Patterson girl." "And?" Tom prompted, sensing there was more. Isabella met his eyes, seeing the question he wasn't quite ready to ask. "And grateful, not just for the vindication, but for everything that led me here. If this hadn't happened, I never would have come to your ranch. I never would have discovered this life, this work, this—" She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. "This what?" Tom asked softly. "This feeling of belonging somewhere," Isabella finished, though they both knew that wasn't quite what she'd been about to say. Tom stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Isabella, now that your name is cleared, you have choices, real choices. You could return to town, re-establish your sewing business, marry any man who catches your fancy. Or," Isabella asked, her heart pounding at something she heard in his voice, "or you could stay here. Not as a refugee or someone seeking sanctuary, but as my partner, in business and in life." Isabella's breath caught. "Tom, are you asking—" "I'm asking if you'd consider making this arrangement permanent. I'm asking if you'd do me the honor of becoming my wife." Isabella stared at him. This good man who'd defended her when no one else would, who'd given her sanctuary without asking for anything in return, who'd helped her rediscover her own strength and worth. "You don't have to answer now," Tom said quickly, mistaking her silence for hesitation. "I know it's sudden, and you've been through so much." "Yes," Isabella interrupted, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you, Tom Harrison. Not because I need rescue or security, but because I choose you. Because you saw who I really was when everyone else saw only scandal. Because you make me want to be the strongest version of myself." Tom's smile was radiant as he pulled her to her feet and into his arms. "Isabella Martinez, you've turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to this ranch." "Even though I was the town disgrace?" she teased, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy. "Especially because of that," Tom replied seriously. "Anyone can love someone when they're easy to love. It takes real character to love someone when the whole world is against them. You've shown me what real strength looks like, what true grace means." As Tom kissed her there in the kitchen, with Maria clapping her hands in delight and the morning sun streaming through the windows, Isabella realized that sometimes the worst thing that could happen to you was actually the best thing in disguise. The scandal that had destroyed her old life had led her to something infinitely better. A love built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of deep understanding that came from weathering storms together. The town Disgrace was about to become the most respected rancher's wife in the territory, and she had never been happier to be wrong about her own future. The news of Tom Harrison's engagement to Isabella Martinez spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire in dry grass. Within hours of the announcement, the ranch began receiving visitors, some coming to offer congratulations, others driven by curiosity, and many bearing gifts that looked suspiciously like guild offerings. Isabella stood at the kitchen window, watching another wagon approach the house. This one belonged to Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner who'd thrown her out 3 weeks ago. The woman's face was pale with shame as she climbed down from her wagon, a covered basket clutched in her trembling hands. "That's the fourth apology visit today," Isabella observed to Maria, who was preparing lunch for their unexpected guests. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this much attention." Maria glanced up from her bread dough with sympathetic eyes. "La gente need to make things right with their consciences, mija. Let them come. Let them say their words. You don't have to forgive them all at once, but you can let them try to earn it." Tom entered the kitchen from the back door, his shirt dusty from morning chores. He'd been fielding similar visits from the men of the community, all eager to repair their relationship with someone they'd wronged so publicly. "Mrs. Patterson's here," Isabella said unnecessarily, since he could see the woman approaching the front porch. Tom studied Isabella's expression carefully. "You don't have to see her if you're not ready. I can send her away." Isabella straightened her shoulders, drawing on the strength she'd discovered during her weeks at the ranch. "No, I need to face this. All of it. If I'm going to be your wife, if I'm going to live in this community, I can't hide from the people I'll be seeing at church and in town for the rest of my life." Tom's smile was proud and tender. "You're stronger than you know, Isabella Martinez." The knock on the front door came soft and hesitant, nothing like the aggressive pounding Isabella remembered from her final night at the boarding house. Tom answered it, his large frame filling the doorway as he greeted their visitor with careful politeness. "Mrs. Patterson." "Good afternoon." The older woman's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Harrison, I was hoping, that is, I wondered if I might speak with Miss Martinez. I have something that belongs to her." Isabella appeared beside Tom, noting how Mrs. Patterson flinched at the sight of her, as if expecting anger or recrimination. Instead, Isabella's voice was calm and measured. "Please come in, Mrs. Patterson. Would you like some coffee?" The boarding house owner looked shocked by the courtesy. She'd clearly expected hostility, perhaps even refusal to see her at all. Yes, thank you. That's very kind." They settled in the parlor, Mrs. Patterson perched nervously on the edge of a chair, while Isabella poured coffee with steady hands. Tom remained standing, a protective presence that wasn't threatening but left no doubt about his loyalties. "I brought your sewing box," Mrs. Patterson began, setting the basket on the side table with reverent care, "and your mother's Bible and the quilt you were working on. I packed your things when I told you to leave, thinking I'd send them after you, but then I didn't know where you'd gone, and—" She trailed off, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Miss Martinez, I don't know how to apologize for what I did, how I treated you, the things I said." Isabella studied the woman who'd once been kind to her, who'd given her affordable lodging and occasional sewing work. "You were protecting your daughter? I understand that." "No, you don't understand," Mrs. Patterson said desperately. "I wasn't protecting Sarah. I was protecting my own reputation. I was so worried about what people would think if I harbored someone involved in a scandal that I threw you out without even asking for your side of the story." The admission hung in the air, brutal in its honesty. Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice breaking. "When I found that letter in Sarah's room, when I realized what that monster was trying to do to my little girl, I understood that you weren't the predator in this situation. You were just another victim, and I made it worse by abandoning you when you needed help most." Isabella felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. This was what she'd needed to hear. Not just an apology, but acknowledgement of the harm that had been done and the courage to face it directly. "How is Sarah?" Isabella asked gently. "Shaken but unharmed, thanks to you," Mrs. Patterson replied. "If Morrison hadn't become fixated on you, if you hadn't absorbed all his attention, I don't want to think about what might have happened to my daughter." Isabella shook her head firmly. "That's not how it works, Mrs. Patterson. Morrison's actions were his own responsibility. I didn't deliberately draw his attention to protect Sarah. I was just trying to survive my grief and find some spiritual comfort." Tom felt a surge of admiration for Isabella's refusal to accept undeserved credit, even when it might have made Mrs. Patterson feel better to assign it to her. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "Sarah wanted to come with me today to apologize in person. I told her it was too soon, that you might not be ready to see people from town yet." "I'd like to see her," Isabella said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "When she's ready, when you think it's appropriate, I'd like her to know that I don't blame her for any of this." The conversation continued for another hour, with Mrs. Patterson sharing details about Morrison's exposure and the community's growing understanding of how badly they'd misjudged the situation. When she finally left, she pressed Isabella's hands between her own weathered palms. "I know I have no right to ask this, but I hope someday you might find it in your heart to forgive a foolish old woman who was too scared of gossip to do what was right." Isabella looked into the older woman's eyes and saw genuine remorse, real understanding of the harm that had been done. "I forgive you, Mrs. Patterson. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger around is exhausting, and I have better things to do with my energy." After Mrs. Patterson left, Isabella sat quietly with her recovered possessions, running her fingers over familiar objects that connected her to her old life. The sewing box her father had made for her 16th birthday, her mother's Bible with its worn leather binding and carefully pressed flowers marking favorite passages, the wedding ring quilt she'd been making for her own hope chest, never knowing when or if she'd have occasion to use it. Tom settled beside her on the sofa, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd her processing of difficult emotions. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. Isabella considered the question seriously. "Some. I regret that Sarah Patterson had to go through fear and confusion because of Morrison's manipulation. I regret that Mrs. Morrison's marriage was built on lies. I regret that it took a scandal to reveal Morrison's true nature, which means there might have been other victims we'll never know about." She paused, her fingers tracing the intricate stitching on her unfinished quilt. "But I don't regret the path that led me here, to this ranch, to you. Even the worst parts, because they taught me things about myself I never would have learned otherwise." Tom took her hand, noting how much steadier it felt than it had just weeks ago. "What kinds of things?" "That I'm stronger than I knew, that I can survive having my reputation destroyed and still maintain my own sense of who I am, that the right people will see my true character regardless of what others say about me." Isabella turned to face him fully. That real love isn't about being protected from hardship. It's about having someone stand beside you while you face it. Tom's kiss was soft and reverent, a seal on promises spoken and unspoken. "Speaking of which," he said when they broke apart, "we should probably start planning a wedding. Unless you want to wait until all the town's apology visits are finished, in which case we might be engaged for the next 6 months." Isabella laughed, the sound bright and free in a way it hadn't been since before her father's death. "I think a simple ceremony here at the ranch would be perfect. Just us, Maria, your brother the judge to perform the service, and maybe a few close friends. Not inviting the whole town to make amends by attending your wedding?" Isabella shook her head decisively. "This wedding is about us, about the life we're choosing to build together. It's not a public relations event or a chance for the community to feel better about how they treated me." Tom studied her face, seeing the wisdom that had grown from surviving betrayal and false accusation. "You've changed since I first brought you here. Grown stronger, more sure of yourself." "I've remembered who I was before grief and fear made me forget," Isabella corrected. "You didn't change me, Tom. You gave me the space and safety to rediscover myself." As they sat together planning their future, Visitors continued to arrive throughout the afternoon. Some brought genuine remorse and meaningful apologies. Others seemed more interested in being seen making the right gestures than in actual reconciliation. Isabella learned to distinguish between the two, accepting sincere regret while politely but firmly refusing to absolve those who sought easy forgiveness without real understanding of their wrongs. By evening, the kitchen table was covered with gift baskets, baked goods, and small tokens of apology from half the town. Maria surveyed the bounty with satisfaction. "Guilt makes people generous," she observed pragmatically. "At least you'll eat well for the next month." Isabella and Tom laughed, but there was truth in Maria's words. The community's shame was manifesting in an outpouring of material generosity that felt both touching and slightly overwhelming. "Tomorrow I'm going into town," Isabella announced suddenly. "I want to visit Sarah Patterson, thank Dr. Whitmore for his apology and show people that I'm not hiding anymore." Tom nodded approvingly. "Want company?" "I'd like that," Isabella admitted. "Not because I need protection, but because I want people to see us together. I want them to understand that this engagement isn't about rescue or convenience. It's about choice and love." As the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Isabella felt a deep contentment settle into her bones. The girl who'd been broken by false accusations was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her own worth, regardless of others' opinions. Tomorrow she would face the town not as a victim seeking vindication, but as a strong woman choosing her future with confidence and grace. The town Disgrace had become something far more powerful, a woman who refused to be defined by other people's failures and fears. The morning of Isabella's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. She stood before the mirror in her room, adjusting the simple white dress Maria had helped her alter from one of her mother's gowns. The lace at the collar had been carefully mended, and new pearl buttons replaced the old ones, but the dress carried the weight of family history and blessing. "You look beautiful, mija," Maria said softly, fastening a strand of pearls around Isabella's neck. Another gift from Tom, passed down from his own mother. "Like a woman who knows exactly who she is and what she wants." Isabella studied her reflection, noting how different she looked from the broken woman who'd arrived at the ranch 2 months ago. Her eyes held confidence instead of shame, her shoulders were straight with quiet dignity, and her smile was genuine rather than forced. The town Disgrace had become someone else entirely, a woman worthy of respect, including her own. The sound of voices outside drew her to the window. A small gathering had assembled in the ranch yard, more people than she'd expected for what was supposed to be a simple ceremony. Judge Harrison stood beneath the oak tree where Tom's parents had been married 30 years earlier, his official robes lending gravity to the occasion. Maria's husband Carlos had ridden in from the neighboring ranch, along with several of Tom's closest friends among the ranching community. But there were others too, people from town who'd specifically asked for permission to witness Isabella's wedding. Mrs. Patterson sat in a chair someone had brought from the house, her daughter Sarah beside her looking nervous but determined. Dr. Whitmore had come with his wife, both of them carrying small gifts. Even Sheriff Benedict was there, his hat in his hands and his expression respectfully solemn. Isabella felt a momentary flutter of anxiety. She'd wanted a small, private ceremony, not a public spectacle that might remind everyone of the scandal that had preceded it. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Tom's voice came through the door, warm with affection and slight nervousness. "Isabella, you ready for this?" She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, dressed in his best black suit with a white shirt that made his gray eyes seem to sparkle. He looked handsome and solid and completely trustworthy. Exactly the kind of man she'd never dared dream might choose her. "You look nervous," she observed with a smile. Tom ran a hand through his carefully combed hair. "Terrified, actually. Not about marrying you. That's the easiest decision I've ever made. But about whether I can be the husband you deserve." Isabella took his hands in hers, noting how they trembled slightly. "Tom Harrison, you've already been everything I needed when I had nothing left. You've seen me at my worst and somehow convinced yourself it was my best. I'm not worried about whether you can be the husband I deserve. I'm wondering if I can be worthy of the faith you've shown in me. More than worthy, Tom said firmly. You're exactly what I've been waiting for my whole life, even when I didn't know I was waiting. Maria cleared her throat pointedly. Enough sweet words. People are waiting, and Father Miguel drove all the way from Santa Fe to bless this union. Isabella's eyes widened in surprise. Father Miguel is here? But I thought your brother was performing the ceremony. Tom's cheeks reddened slightly. I may have arranged for both. James will handle the legal requirements, but I wanted you to have the religious blessing too, if that's all right with you. Father Miguel knew your parents. He said he'd be honored to officiate. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes at Tom's thoughtfulness. Having Father Miguel there would indeed make the ceremony feel complete, connecting her new life to the family and faith that had shaped her. They walked outside together, and Isabella was surprised by the warmth of the reception that greeted them. These weren't people come to gawk at a spectacle, but friends and neighbors who genuinely come to witness and celebrate a union they now recognized as right and good. Father Miguel stepped forward, his weathered face creased with a gentle smile. Isabella, my child, you look radiant. Your parents would be so proud to see you today. The ceremony was simple, but deeply moving. Judge Harrison handled the legal formalities with dignified efficiency, while Father Miguel offered the religious blessing with genuine warmth and personal knowledge of both families involved. When Tom slipped the wedding ring onto Isabella's finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother, his voice was steady and sure. With this ring, I promise to love and honor you, not because you're perfect, but because you're perfectly suited for me. I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges we face and to see your strength even when you can't see it yourself. Isabella's vows, when her turn came, carried the weight of everything they'd been through together. Tom, you found me when I was lost and helped me find myself again. You saw my worth when the world saw only scandal. I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams while pursuing my own, and to love you not just for what you've given me, but for who you are. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, the assembled crowd erupted in genuine applause and celebration. But Isabella only had eyes for her new husband, this good man who'd chosen to build a life with her, despite every social pressure to do otherwise. The reception was held right there in the ranch yard, with tables set up under the trees and food provided by half the county. Isabella moved through the celebration with growing wonder at how different this felt from her darkest imaginings 2 months ago. Instead of being shunned and whispered about, she was being welcomed and celebrated. Mrs. Patterson approached during the dancing, her expression tentative but hopeful. Mrs. Harrison, I wanted to thank you again for your forgiveness, but also for what your experience taught our whole community about the danger of rushing to judgment. Isabella studied the older woman's face, seeing genuine change rather than mere politeness. I hope we've all learned something valuable, Mrs. Patterson. I know I have. What's that? Isabella glanced over at Tom, who was deep in conversation with his brother, his face animated with happiness and contentment. That sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the doorway to the best thing. If Morrison hadn't tried to manipulate me, if the town hadn't turned against me, I never would have ended up here. I never would have discovered what real partnership looks like. Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. You're different now. Stronger, more sure of yourself. I'm exactly who I always was, Isabella corrected gently. I just stopped letting other people define me. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the celebration in golden light, Isabella found herself dancing with her husband under the same oak tree where they'd spoken their vows. The fiddle music was simple but joyful, and the faces surrounding them were filled with genuine happiness for their union. Any regrets? Tom asked softly as they swayed together. Isabella looked around at their friends and neighbors, at the ranch that was now truly her home, at the man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. Only one, she said with a mischievous smile. Tom's eyebrows rose in concern. What's that? That it took a scandal to bring us together. I would have preferred a less dramatic beginning to our love story. Tom threw back his head and laughed, the sound rich and free. Isabella Harrison, with you, I have a feeling drama is always going to be in short supply. You're far too sensible and strong for that. Isabella smiled up at her husband, this man who'd rescued her not by solving her problems, but by giving her the space and support to solve them herself. The town Disgrace had indeed become something else. A respected rancher's wife, a woman of substance and dignity, someone worthy of love and capable of giving it in return. As they danced under the stars, Isabella knew with absolute certainty that her story was just beginning. The best chapters were yet to be written. 5 years later, Isabella Harrison stood on the front porch of the ranch house, watching her husband teach their 4-year-old daughter, Elena, how to braid a horse's mane. The little girl's dark curls caught the morning sunlight as she concentrated intently on Tom's patient instructions, her small fingers working carefully through the bay mare's coarse hair. "Like this, Papa?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the same determined precision Isabella remembered from her own childhood. "Perfect, sweetheart," Tom replied, his voice warm with pride. "You're a natural with the horses, just like your mama." Isabella smiled, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their second child grew strong and active. This pregnancy had been different from her first, anticipated with joy rather than discovered with surprise, supported by a loving husband and thriving community rather than faced alone. The ranch had prospered beyond even Tom's ambitious dreams. Isabella's business acumen had proven invaluable, and together they'd expanded their operations to include a breeding program that supplied quality horses throughout the territory. Her meticulous record-keeping and strategic planning had turned what was once a comfortable living into genuine prosperity. But more than financial success, they'd built something deeper, a partnership that honored both their strengths and supported their individual growth. Tom had encouraged Isabella's involvement in territorial politics, where her intelligence and moral clarity had made her a respected voice in women's rights and education reform. She, in turn, had helped him develop the social connections that had expanded their business reach while maintaining the integrity that defined his character. A rider approached from the direction of town, and Isabella recognized Dr. Whitmore's distinctive bay gelding. The doctor had become not just a neighbor, but a genuine friend over the years, someone who'd learned from his initial misjudgment and grown into a man worthy of respect. "Afternoon, Isabella," he called out as he dismounted. "How are you feeling? Any concerns about the pregnancy?" Isabella laughed, patting her belly affectionately. "Strong as a horse, as Maria keeps telling me. This little one seems determined to be born kicking." Dr. Whitmore grinned, tying his horse to the hitching post. "With parents like you and Tom, I'd expect nothing less. Actually, I came by with some news I thought you'd want to hear." Tom looked up from his lesson with Elena, his attention caught by the doctor's serious tone. "It's about Morrison, Doctor," Whitmore continued. "Just got word from Denver. He's been arrested for fraud and corruption, along with several other charges involving young women in Colorado Springs. Seems his pattern finally caught up with him." Isabella felt a complex mix of emotions at the news. Relief that Morrison would face justice, sadness for his victims, and gratitude that her own experience had helped expose his crimes. "How many women?" she asked quietly. "At least 8 that they've identified, going back over a decade. Your courage in speaking out, even when the town initially turned against you, helped several of them find the strength to come forward with their own stories." Tom moved to Isabella's side, his hand finding hers in the automatic gesture of support that had become second nature over the years. "He won't hurt anyone else," he said simply. Elena tugged on Isabella's skirt, her young mind struggling to understand the serious conversation happening above her head. "Mama, why does the doctor look sad?" Isabella knelt down to her daughter's level, marveling at how different this conversation was from the ones she'd imagined having about her past. "Sometimes, sweetheart, bad people hurt good people. But when the good people are brave enough to tell the truth, the bad people get stopped from hurting others." "Are you a brave good person, Mama?" Isabella felt tears prick her eyes at the innocent question. "I try to be, Elena. Every day I try to be." After Dr. Whitmore left, Isabella and Tom sat on the porch swing they'd installed after Elena's birth, watching their daughter play with the barn cats in the fading afternoon light. The scene was peaceful, domestic, everything Isabella had once dreamed of, but never dared believe she deserved. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Morrison hadn't targeted you?" Tom asked, his arm around Isabella's shoulders as she leaned against his chest. Isabella considered the question, as she had many times over the years. "I used to. But I've decided it doesn't matter. What happened, happened. How we responded to it, how we chose to build our life afterward, that's what matters. Tom pressed a kiss to the top of her head. No regrets about the path that brought us together? None, Isabella said firmly. Not even the painful parts. They taught me things about myself I needed to know. They showed me what real strength looks like, what genuine love can accomplish. Elena ran up to the porch, her cheeks flushed with exertion and joy. Mama, Papa, watch this! She performed an elaborate curtsy she'd been practicing, her face glowing with pride at her accomplishment. Isabella and Tom applauded enthusiastically, their daughter's simple pleasure in mastering a new skill, filling them both with that particular joy that comes from watching your child discover their own capabilities. Beautiful sweetheart, Isabella said. You've been practicing very hard. As they prepared for dinner, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who'd once been branded the town's disgrace had become one of its most respected citizens. She served on the school board, organized charitable events, and was frequently consulted on matters affecting the community's welfare. But more than public respect, she'd found something invaluable, a sense of her own worth that couldn't be shaken by others' opinions or destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. The scared, broken woman who'd stumbled into Tom's life had been replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it with grace and dignity. Mama, Elena said during dinner, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. Mrs. Patterson told me that you and Papa have the most beautiful love story in the whole territory. What's a love story? Isabella exchanged an amused glance with Tom before answering. A love story is what happens when two people choose each other, not just once, but every day. When they support each other through difficult times and celebrate together during happy ones. Like how Papa helped you when you were sad, and now you help him with the horse books? Exactly like that, Tom confirmed. Love isn't just a feeling, Elena. It's a choice you make, and then you keep making it over and over. Elena nodded solemnly, as if filing away important information for future use. I want a love story like yours when I grow up. Isabella reached across the table to touch her daughter's hand. Then remember this, sweetheart. Never let anyone convince you that you're not worthy of love. Your worth comes from who you are, not from what others think about you. As they tucked Elena into bed that night, Isabella felt the profound satisfaction of a life well lived. The baby kicked strongly, as if eager to join this family built on mutual respect, shared values and love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. Later, as she and Tom sat before the fireplace, Isabella opened the leather journal where she'd been recording family stories for Elena and the baby to read someday. She wanted them to understand their heritage, not just the happy parts, but the struggles that had shaped their parents' characters. What are you writing about tonight? Tom asked, settling beside her on the sofa. Isabella smiled, her pen poised over the page. About how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the doorway to the best thing. About how real love sees worth where others see only scandal. About how strength isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite it. Tom read over her shoulder as she wrote, To my children, your mama was once called the town disgrace. Your papa chose to see her differently. From that choice, everything beautiful in our lives has grown. Remember this when the world tries to tell you who you are, only you get to decide that. And remember that love isn't about being perfect, it's about choosing each other perfectly, every single day. As the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the oak trees outside, Isabella Harrison finished her story and closed the journal. The town disgrace had become a woman of substance, a respected wife and mother, someone whose greatest triumph wasn't in proving her accusers wrong, but in refusing to let their judgment define her. Outside, the stars shone over the ranch where two wounded souls had found healing in each other's love, where children played safely in the knowledge that they were cherished, and where every sunrise brought new opportunities to choose love over fear, hope over despair, and grace over judgment. The disgrace had become a blessing, and the blessing would last forever. And there you have it, the remarkable journey of Isabella Martinez, who transformed from town disgrace to one of the most respected women in the territory. What strikes me most about Isabella's story is how it shows us that other people's opinions don't define our worth. When an entire community turned against her based on lies and manipulation, Isabella could have internalized that shame and let it destroy her. Instead, she found the strength to rebuild her life on her own terms. Tom Harrison represents the kind of person we all need in our corner. Someone who looks past reputation and gossip to see character and truth. He didn't rescue Isabella because she was helpless. He supported her while she rescued herself. That's what real love looks like. The American frontier was unforgiving, but it was also where people could reinvent themselves, where second chances were possible for those brave enough to seize them. Isabella's transformation from victim to survivor to community leader shows us that our lowest moments don't have to define us. They can be the foundation for our greatest triumphs. Morrison's eventual arrest reminds us that truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful people try to bury it. Isabella's courage in speaking out helped other victims find their voices too. What do you think about Isabella's choice to forgive those who wronged her? Was it wisdom or weakness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit subscribe for more incredible Wild West stories of courage and redemption. Next week, the outlaw's daughter who became a judge. Until then, remember, you are not what others say about you. You are what you choose to become. See you on the frontier.